Why I Believe in God, Part 4, the fourth 10 years of my life. In Part 1, I had looked at the first 10 years of my life. These can be summarized as the years of serene bliss despite sailing over choppy and troubled waters. In Part 2, I looked at the second 10 years of my life. These can be summarized as the years wherein I made three key decisions at the ages of 11, 12, and 17. These gave me the strong foundation that would shape my future life. In Part 3, I looked at the third 10 years of my life. These can be summarized as years where I found myself at the very bottom rung of the corporate ladder and had no one to trust but God, who through people around me gave me messages that guided me and allowed me to climb the ladder of success. In this part, Part 4, I will look at the fourth 10 years of my life. These can be summarized as the years wherein, despite me living my life based on simplicity, humility, and trust in God, God brought immense prosperity and abundance into my life during these 10 years. Let me tell you my story. I think that God has a pattern for my life. Just like all the decades before, at the start of this decade too, I once again found myself at the starting point. I said, "Oh no, not again. I have already run a race in the last decade and have come out successful. I do not want to run yet another race." I lived my life on the three pillars of simplicity, humility, and trust in God, and I did not have any further ambition for the future as God had given me everything I ever wanted. Over the last 2 years, I had got married. I had emigrated to England. Immediately after that, I was blessed with a lovely son and had bought a 3-bedroom house in London. I considered this as having achieved the heights of success and thanked God who had given me everything I ever wanted. I could not ask for anything more. However, I think God wanted to show me once again that God's ways are not man's ways and that God does things in His own time. It suddenly dawned on me that I was at the start of another new race, one of which I had no prior experience. This was a new kind of race. Everything was new. On the one hand, I was newly married with a wife and kid. I had to learn how to live with family, how to adjust and cope with the pressures and stresses of family life, how to cope with looking after a tiny baby, and how to manage the finances so that the family needs were satisfied and fulfilled. On the other hand, I was adjusting to life in a new country. It was a life in a different climatic condition, a different culture, a different currency, and a different perspective on looking at things. As I said earlier, I did not know what to expect, but one thing I knew was that I had absolutely no big dreams or ambitions for the future. When I bought my 3-bedroom house, I had absolutely no spare money, as all the money I had collected went towards the deposit on this house. I told the person selling the house to me that I would be grateful for any furniture that he would leave behind. I knew his heart was touched because in his generosity he left behind some old furniture which consisted of an old bed, a dining table, some chairs, and a sofa. This was more than sufficient for me, and I thanked God for His bountiful blessings. I also visited my other neighbors across the street to introduce myself, and one of them mentioned to me, "You are late," he said. "You are late in buying this house. If you had bought this house 5 years earlier, you would have paid half the amount for it." I did not know why he was telling me this, as what he was saying did not apply to me in the slightest. I had only entered England 2 years earlier with nothing more than a suitcase of clothes and an advance of 1 month's salary. All the same, the message that this neighbor gave me struck a chord deep in my heart, and I just felt that God was urging me to buy a second property. The next year, God blessed me with a beautiful daughter. I can still remember the day she was born. She was a big baby and hence had to be delivered through C-section. And through her, God had provided yet another blessing into my life. My family was now growing. As another year passed, I noticed that the property prices in London were rising fast. And by now, my first property in London was worth much more than when I had bought it 3 years ago. At that time, something strange happened. I happened to visit my son's school for a charity event, and unknown to me, I happened to buy a second-hand book entitled "Screw It, Let's Do It" by Richard Branson. I say it was strange because I do not know why I picked up this book and bought it, and I didn't know who Richard Branson was. But something within me urged me to read this book. I devoured the book like a hungry lion, and it taught me lessons in entrepreneurship and risk-taking that I could not have learnt through any business school. I am sure that God wanted me to read this book, as this is the way God had worked in my life in the past. He brought things across to me and prompted me to do things. I would have seen and read so many things during that time, but none of them had so much of an influence on my life as this one thick fat book by a person called Richard Branson. Fired up by the inspiration of Richard Branson, I bought 2 more properties in London. The deposit for one of them was from my 2 years of savings, and the deposit for the other was by remortgaging my first property. I was now 34 years old and owned 3 properties in London, but I did not as yet own a car. I remember telling a colleague at work, "I have never sat in front of a steering wheel." To which he replied, "Steering wheel of a Ferrari?" I was a bit surprised and clarified to him that I had never ever driven a car in my life before. He was so surprised. He was more surprised than me, and he just could not imagine how someone at the age of 34 had not yet driven a car before. So I then took driving lessons and bought my first car at the age of 34. I can still remember looking at the car parked outside my house and pinching myself and asking, "Is this real? Am I dreaming?" It was a small car, so I asked, "Do I really own that car?" For the first 7 years of my life in England, I worked for a multinational telecoms company. My job was in IT, and I would do software programming, and it gave me great joy to know that the systems and reports I had developed was being used by employees all across the globe, in the US, in England, in Dubai, in Hong Kong. However, after a time of prosperity, the telecom sector fell on hard times, and we were aware that our jobs were at stake. I do not know why, but even at this time, there was a peace in my heart because I knew that someone divine was in control of my life. I once again pledged my life into the hands of my divine Creator. I said to him, "The job of moving my ship forward is in my hands, but the job of steering the ship in the right direction belongs to you, my God." The telecom company filed for bankruptcy, Chapter 11, and was bought out by another telecoms company. We as employees received all the support in terms of professional help in creating our CVs, preparing for our interviews, and I also got a huge redundancy payment for the 7 years I had worked there. Even before I left the telecom company, I managed to secure another job with an American software company. It was a services company. This new job was located outside London and in the beautiful English countryside. I had always lived in a city all my life, and had never known that there was something called a beautiful countryside. I vividly remember driving through the English countryside on my way to work and began to feel that I was in a place that was immensely beautiful. I did not understand what I was feeling, but it felt a little like paradise. It was calm, serene, and majestically beautiful. I soon began to fall in love with the English countryside and decided that I did not want to live in the big city in London anymore. I knew I would be giving up a lot of things. I would be giving up the glitter, the glamour, the hustle, the bustle of city life. But my mind was made up. I wanted to live in the open, breathe the fresh air, live in nature, live in the English countryside. It was at this time that I used the money for my redundancy payment to buy my fourth three-bedroom house in London. I was now 37 years old and had spent the last year commuting daily from London to the south of England. My small little car would not survive this arduous journey, and besides, my wife had just learnt driving and needed the car for the school runs. Thus, at the age of 37, I bought my second car. It was a much bigger family car, which could be converted into a seven-seater if needed. I enjoyed driving on the motorways, and lucky for me, I did not have a problem with congestion on the motorway, as I was driving contraflow. I was driving out when people were driving in, and vice versa. Besides, my job as a management consultant meant that my company paid me a mileage allowance to cover the fuel expenses. I decided to relocate my family to a seaside town in the south of beautiful England. My family at first did not support my decision, as my kids had got attached to their schools and friends in London. But when they saw that I was spending 3 to 4 hours daily on the motorway, they felt sorry for me and accepted to move. Living in a seaside town had its own charm. My company paid for a rented apartment which was located on the second floor overlooking the promenade, and from my balcony window I got the most beautiful view of the sunrise and the sunsets over the English Channel, and I could see the ships on the water and hear their foghorns blaring out in the morning mist. Life was going well for me. I do not know why God was blessing me, because I was not doing anything special or extraordinary for Him in return. All I did was acknowledge that He was in control and that I trusted my life completely in His hands. I was now nearing 39 years of age, and for the past 3 years had worked for this American software company. My company asked me to move out of London and relocate on a permanent basis in the south of England, and thus, using the relocation allowance as a deposit, I bought my fifth three-bedroom house in the south of England. Another change for me was that in the last decade I had worked 6 days a week, but in the current decade I only had to work 5 days a week. In the last decade my boss expected me to work late every day, but in the current decade my boss encouraged me to have a healthy work-life balance. In the last decade it was difficult getting annual leave, even to get married, but in the current decade my boss encouraged me to use up all my leave, as only 5 days could be carried forward into the new year. Life only got better for me in this new decade, and I kept asking myself, when will the bad times come? How will I cope if bad times come my way? But rather than feel scared, I just had peace, knowing that someone more powerful than me had me in His care, and that I would get the strength to face up to anything that would come my way. It was at this time that England was in the grip of a global recession, and property prices had stagnated for the last 3 years. Besides, property prices in the south of England were half that of similar properties in London. Therefore, I used my savings that I had accumulated over the past 3 years to purchase my sixth and seventh three-bedroom properties in the south of England. Looking back at these 10 years, I ask myself, what does God want for me? Why is He working all these miracles in my life? How can someone who enters England with no money, just a suitcase of clothes, no ambition, but just gratitude in his heart for all that has gone on in his life, how can somebody like him take inspiration from a book like from Richard Branson, and over the next 10 years climb the ladder of prosperity and own 2 cars and 7 properties in England? Is this possible for someone with no ambition and with no connections in life? No, but I am reminded again and again that God's ways are not man's ways, and that God does things in His own time. And if anyone were to ask me why I believe in God, I just have to show them my life and tell them to see for themselves all the wonderful things that God has worked in my life, and how God is leading me along the straight path and protecting me from all the pleasures and sinful attractions of this world, and thus keeping me straight, honest, sincere, and true to Him. I just remind myself again and again, God's ways are not man's ways, and that God does things in His own time.